Hey everyone, Anarch here. So this is another installment in the series that I call Anarch Abridged. And the topic of today's sort of wild ramble is going to be the value of conflict, or the importance of conflict, or perhaps how to have healthy conflict. So, this one is sort of purposely oriented as it is because the last video I made was the importance of cooperation. And, I sort of mentioned that, it's not that, competition is bad in and of itself. It's bad as a social default. It's bad as a way to run society, right? And, conflict is probably even more complicated. Conflict is not just synonymous with competition, okay? So competition is where, we pit ourselves against one another to achieve some sort of goal. And then there is typically the ability for us to determine some sort of victor for which there will be some sort of reward, typically. This is very, very much the broad strokes, right? Whereas conflict is just two people having some oppositional relation to one another. That is to say, two of them perhaps disagree about something or just have different interests that might manifest in a form of competition. But conflict can also drive people to cooperate. Conflict is a very complicated impulse. And what I want to say is that in cooperative spaces, you will have to have ways of dealing with conflict, okay? So, conflict is where we might take some sort of oppositional stance, right? Sort of this broad way of seeing it, wherein we might enter some contentious territory over our opposition to one another. But conflict can take many forms, right? Just a verbal disagreement is a form of conflict. Getting into a fight would be an example of a physical conflict. You might imagine, we often say, we use the word conflict as synonymous with war or battle. They got into a conflict, the conflict in some certain region and so on. Okay. So conflict is very broad, but what I want to talk about here today mostly is the importance of being able to have healthy conflict. Okay. Maybe I'll get a little bit into how we will need to be able to weather conflict more broadly for the tasks that are ahead of us, right? So one thing that I've noticed, and part of the reason why I think I was inclined to make this video, is that I've noticed almost all of the generations alive today. And, I mean this with an extremely broad brush. I'm talking about the boomers. I'm talking about the millennials. I'm talking about the zoomers. I'm talking about Generation X. I'm talking about all these generations that are currently alive. They seem to be all pretty bad at dealing with interpersonal conflict. I think they're bad at dealing with it in a variety of different ways and for different reasons. I think the millennials and the zoomers are probably bad at dealing with it because they learned how to have conflict on the internet, which is a really terrible place to learn how to have conflict. I mean, it has its value, but it also teaches you a bunch of really bad habits and bad understandings of how to interact with other human beings. And the boomers and Gen Xers, because they have been sort of oblivious in a very general sense. They were sort of coddled as a generation. They're probably one of the most coddled generations in human history. So they never really had to learn how to have healthy conflict. Everything was much easier. So they essentially were taught to be extremely selfish, and everything that they were taught about how to weather conflict was just how to either A, win in the conflict, or B, to just avoid conflict because it was annoying to think about and everybody just wanted to focus on achieving their goals within society, you might say. I think Gen X started to move away from this a little bit, but they didn't really do a whole lot better in discovering some sort of ethic for how to interact with conflict. Instead, you just kind of got this edgelordiness. And then by the time you get to the millennials, you know, perhaps there's a little bit more orientation towards sincerity, but I think the millennials and generation and the Zoomers are both kind of bad at dealing with conflict. Both of these generations tend to operate a lot from knee-jerk in conflict. They have a tendency to totalize their enemy. I think once again, the internet has been a big part of this, but they tend to, I'm a millennial, I'll just, of course, put that out there. I think that there's a lot of people in both of these generations that they have heard, if they've heard some kind of argument being made by their worst enemy, they then think anybody who makes that argument is their worst enemy, and they get hyper defensive and they tend to just shut people down. And this is an unhealthy form of conflict. So obviously, you know, as I've said in numerous of these videos, because I've done numerous of these videos now that kind of deal with these problems of interpersonal engagement and like people not dealing well with interpersonal engagement. But obviously, I have to make the caveat that, you know, you're not going to be able to have healthy conflict with everyone. Not everybody's going to respond well to, you know, dispute or debate or, you know, any of these things. Some people, it's also going to be a waste of your time. They don't care. Their purpose for having conflict is to confuse and discourage you. But what I want to present here is that all of that being said, if we cannot weather conflict in a healthy way, we are guaranteed to lose. And you know, you might hear that and be like, oh, why? Because we won't be able to change the viewpoints of our opponents, because we won't be able to, you know, convert lots of people to our viewpoint, you know, and so on. No, that's actually not really what I'm getting at. I mean, that's part of it, yes. But I mean more to say we are not going to be able to weather our internal problems within the movement spaces, within organizations, and, you know, just more broadly in radical spaces that might arise as social ruptures get worse. Okay, because there are always going to be disagreements between people. There is never going to be a perfect utopia where everyone gets along. It's, once again, this is all bearing in mind everything I said about cooperation. There will always be oppositional viewpoints. No matter how good of a society you create, there will always be a diversity of different thinking. And there will always be, and as we know from the narcissism of small differences, it doesn't matter how unified you think you have made society on some set of viewpoints. There will always be differences within how people approach those viewpoints, and that will create conflict. Okay, it will create an oppositional stance wherein there is a sort of like field of contention between these two viewpoints. And that conflict will have to be resolved in healthy ways, or it will be resolved in unhealthy ways, because you can't just not resolve conflict. It's not good enough to just split yourself off into tinier and tinier echo chambers where everybody already agrees with you. That is not an example of healthy conflict. That is an example of avoidance. And in a general sense, it's almost like an avoidant attachment style, except with the rest of society. Okay, you're not dealing with the problems at hand. You're avoiding the problems that are confronting you. You're avoiding, I think what the worst part about it is for me is that you're avoiding learning in the process. And you're not allowing others to learn in this process either, because you are in the process when you cut conflict short and you don't allow conflict to take place in a healthy fashion. all you really do is you shut yourself off from possible improvement, from being able to hear where maybe you're wrong. And if you're not, you have prevented them from finding out that they're wrong, because you've approached this conflict in a way where it's like very scorched earth, where you're just prepared to discard the person at a whim as soon as they disagree with you. I think this is a very unhealthy impulse, which has been cultivated by the internet, where it's easy to run away from your problems because you can just block people, or you can mute them, or you can, once again, cultivate a tinier and tinier echo chamber of people who agree with you on everything, and where there's no conflict. So I think that the internet has had a bad effect on people's I think the internet has increased the amount of conflict taking place, but it has not taught us how to have healthy conflict. So I keep saying this over and over and over. What a healthy conflict. I think healthy conflict takes place when we both approach one another with an understanding that we have different viewpoints, but that is not a judgment of the other person's character or personhood. Okay, I think that's one of the main characteristics of healthy conflict. That is to say, when we are disagreeing about ideas, about viewpoints, and a person is not defined by their ideas or viewpoints. Now, don't get me wrong, if a person acts out really, really dangerous ideas or viewpoints in the world, things kind of change. It changes into a different form of conflict. Now we're talking about, people holding real power in the world, which could do violence and may therefore necessitate a very different sort of approach. But I think that writ large, that's not the kind of conflict we are faced with in our daily life when we deal with people in an interpersonal sense, nor even most of the time when we're interacting with people on the internet, or, even strangers we might meet. Most of the time, people just have this complex hodgepodge of ideas, which, quite contrary to what we might desire, they haven't really thought them through very far a lot of the time. People haven't really carried out where all of these ideas lead to their utmost. They haven't thought about what they imply and where they come from, and what sort of ideologies prop them up. Now, that's not to say that those things may not permeate into their minds and justify all kinds of other dangerous ideas. That, in fact, does often happen. It's actually a very pernicious, sort of dangerous thing that takes place all the time. But I mean to say that if you hear somebody say something that sounds like indicative of a bad thing you've heard before, it's not to say you don't call the person out, but you should probably not treat them as if they are that ideological enemy that you met on the internet or something, For example, you hear this a human nature argument all the time. The human nature argument. Humans just aren't good enough. It's not within humans to do X, Y, Z. Okay, now that argument is made by capitalists, it's made by fascists, it's made by people who are like monarchists even, okay? Like there's just these few humans that are good enough, and most of us suck. So the really good ones, they have to step up and do the work to keep things in order, this great man theory of history sort of thing. But if you just meet some normal person who is very well kind of tuned out of politics, and they make the human nature argument, and what you do is you knee-jerk and you start pretending as if they're the fascist you argued with last week on the internet, and you don't just treat them as a human being who might have an inconsistent belief system, who is not defined by that belief, but maybe just holds an erroneous belief, and instead you just start to get angry and defensive and demeaning, you have bumbled an opportunity to actually transform someone's mind. That won't transform anyone's mind. That's not to say that that process isn't going to be one that will be oriented around conflict. Once again, it probably will. But it can be a healthy conflict if you enter that conversation with a calm head and respect, a sort of charitable viewpoint, understanding that this person probably isn't some kind of horrific bigot or eugenicist, even if they might hold those viewpoints, they themselves are not defined by that viewpoint. I think that's a really important aspect of it. Another aspect of it is kind of what I was intimating right there, which is that in these cooperative spaces where we are organizing together or we're around people who are ostensible allies, one of the most important aspects is being able to maintain a cool head and to not get defensive and not getting upset and not becoming insulting or demeaning or sarcastic. And instead, being able to listen to an opponent viewpoint and being able to actually think through what they are saying, actually being able to analyze the arguments that they are making. And I think this is honestly, this part we've kind of, when I say this, I think we're kind of stumbling on one of the problems that I think is very operative here. And that is people get defensive like that. People get upset. People get demeaning. People become sarcastic because they are actually insecure. Because they are actually afraid of engaging with an opponent viewpoint. Deep down inside, they are not confident in their viewpoint. They're not confident that they will be able to answer all criticisms. They are trying to shut the person down because they think that if push comes to shove and that person keeps pushing and keeps pushing and keeps pushing, they are going to fold. That they're going to find a flaw in their ideas. And that manifests as a demeaning and insulting sort of orientation. And I think this is an incredibly common thing. I think that a lot of people act this way because they haven't actually done the necessary study to have confidence in their viewpoints. Because when you become confident in your viewpoint, once you're confident in your ideas, you don't really need to be afraid and you don't need to bluff with, anger and insult or, defensive postures. You have a sort of calm confidence in your ideas. You're willing to go down the whole rabbit hole because you're confident that you could go as far down the rabbit hole as this person likes. And at the very end, they would have to conclude that you're right because you've answered every single objection. You understood their ideas as they actually were, not as a straw man, not as some, distraction or something, but as their ideas actually are in engaging with their arguments as they actually are. And that you could do that and you would still come out correct. You would still be able to demonstrate that your ideas are correct. Because if you have that confidence, you have no reason to get upset and annoyed and demeaning and insulting and so on. It's just unnecessary. And you cultivate that kind of confidence by repeatedly engaging in conflict. Okay? You have to bravely engage in conflict over and over and over, and then see that your ideas are withstanding scrutiny. And if you do that over and over and over, you start to see the trends. You start to develop confidence in those ideas. Number two, if you study enough, if you've read a lot of theory and history and argumentation, and you've consumed a lot of people discussing those ideas, if you do that, you're going to develop confidence. You're going to say, yeah, I remember when this person made that argument in this text, or I remember when XYZ brought this up in the debate I watched or whatever, the discussion I saw between these two people. And you start to have touchstones. And every little thing stops being scary. You don't need to knee-jerk. You don't need to be cruel and demeaning and dismissive because you have confidence that this has become familiar, right? This becomes familiar. You go, oh yeah, yeah. Oh, I see. I know where this leads. They're saying this because it's prefaced to that, and then they're going to say this, and then I'm going to say this, and they're going to say this. And once you've seen that all play out over and over and over, it stops being scary. You start, it just starts being like, oh, okay, here's where we're going. Cool. I know what I'm supposed to say in response to that. I've heard these sorts of talking points, and that is the goal. Okay. That sort of calm, cool-headed, confident, reassured method of approaching people that you're in conflict with. That's how you have healthy conflict. Okay? Here's the thing. Healthy conflict requires the other person to do that as well. So, it's very difficult to have healthy conflict when only one side is trying to engage in healthy conflict and the other person is doing all of the things that I just said that we're not supposed to do. Knee-jerking, getting upset and getting defensive and being demeaning and being dismissive and sarcastic and so on. If one side is doing that and the other side is trying to engage in healthy conflict, it pretty much never goes anywhere for a variety of reasons. And it kind of turns into a spectacle and it becomes pointless and becomes all about dunking and scoring points. And that is nonsense. I mean, that's silly. That's maybe insofar as that, we're talking about debating, having a purpose. You can go watch my video, Value of Dispute, see more of my opinion on that. But if we're talking about that, maybe that stuff can have some value. But I would say that insofar as that you're actually trying to engage in healthy conflict, and we're discussing what healthy conflict is, that stuff has no place in healthy conflict. And if one side is doing that, we need to be cultivating communities that call people out for doing that. When we are in a situation where it is an environment where it's safe to have a discourse about something and one side is trying to engage in healthy conflict and the other side is trying to dunk and score points and is being petty and insulting, we need to be creating a community that doesn't just go, well, I want to stay out of this, but instead calls out the person who is petty and demeaning and is just trying to score points. No matter what they're saying, people need to not be taking their side while they do that. And unfortunately, we've developed this silly habit of saying that that's tone policing, but no, it's just stopping people from being harassing. Okay, that's all it is. Like when somebody is doing those behaviors where they are knee-jerking and being insulting, and somebody tells them to stop, that's not tone policing, that's telling them to stop harassing other people within our spaces. Okay, we should not be allowing people to be harassing in spaces where we're supposed to be having healthy conflict. Okay, so this is like a basic overview of how to have healthy conflict. And I found that it is shockingly rare that people can engage in this and a big part of it is I think that people get really confused thinking that their ideas are them. And therefore, if you attack their ideas, you are attacking them. And that's just wrong. That's not how this works. You are not your ideas. Your ideas can change. You can hold different beliefs. If somebody is attacking your ideas, you are not obliged to run defense for those ideas if they're wrong, and you don't need to double down on them because it doesn't really reflect on you if you're changing your mind. If those ideas are wrong and you back off of them, that reflects on you positively. When somebody critiques an idea, they're not critiquing you. Or, I mean, maybe sometimes they are, but in healthy conflict, they're not. They shouldn't be. They should be critiquing the effect of the idea, whether the idea is wrong or right. And what I see is a lot of people that react to someone criticizing their ideas as if they are being criticized themselves. I think this is a very immature response. This is not how it works. This I think is kind of the product of this, supermarket of ideology approach, where, when you're shopping for an ideology, you're shopping for something that defines you. Like you're looking for some, label, and then you become imbued with something in the process of holding some belief. Oh, I've got the right ideas, I've got the right line. And so, now I'm doing what needs to be done. And, I have to defend this with my life religiously. I have to become a zealot because, you've made that idea define you, instead of doing what you should be doing, which is trying to develop ideas that actually accord to reality. The ideas, and what we should be discussing, is whether ideas and things and actions accord to reality as it is and reality as it should be. That's what we should be discussing. And in healthy conflict, we should be in a process of trying to work that out. You'd be trying to see if a person's ideas, stand up to scrutiny. And we should be trying to cultivate environments where this is okay to do, where it's okay to question people's ideas, where it's okay to hold people accountable. And wherein, when people respond in these immature ways where they're lashing out, that is not okay, and that people call them out for it. And that needs to become the norm. It needs to become the norm that people are called out for being petty and insulting, because that's harassment. That's harassing behavior. It's not okay. Obviously, once again, I'll provide the context that I'm talking about. Conflict within our spaces, but with people that we trust and that we know are not ideological enemies. Obviously, these things that I'm discussing become pretty different when we're talking about, for example, any sort of discourse or conflict with, ideological opponents, especially, for example, fascists, or people who are already engaged in violent conflict with us, people whose ideologies are predicated around machismo. Often you have to take a very different approach with these people, because now you are just taking place upon this sort of battlefield, this raw battlefield of power. These people, it wouldn't matter what you said. They don't care. They're your opponents. They're not going to be practicing any sort of internal introspection. They consider introspection weakness. That requires a very different approach. And I will try to talk about that a little more broadly in future videos. I know this one was a little bit more of a ramble than a lot of the ones I've been doing. These things have been on my mind a lot. And I have a lot more thoughts about this topic. But this one was kind of a fire hose, just getting a lot of things off my chest, I guess. And feel free to respond down in the in the comments. Engage in an unhealthy conflict, get very angry and demeaning if you like, or engage in healthy conflict. Tell me where you disagree, and how, if you agree, to what degree. Under what conditions do these things that I've described apply, and under what conditions do they not apply? That sounds great. Please do so in the comments below. If you like the video, if you agree with me, then give me a like. That's what the algorithm wants. If you'd like to hear more of me talking about things like this or all kinds of other things on the channel, subscribe down below. Lastly, if you support the work that I'm doing on this channel, I'd like to encourage you to go become a patron at my Patreon, which is patreon.com/anarch. Not only, as I've been saying in the previous videos, am I right on the cusp of being able to actually do this channel full time. So every patron that I get right now matters enormously. But I am also very poor right now. My side gigs have definitely not been getting me a lot of money here in the month of December. So just know that in a very immediate term sense, more patrons would really help me out financially in this month or two of struggle that's going to be taking place right here. I just want to tell you all how much I appreciate you. I'm very grateful that this channel is growing to the point where I might be able to spend a full-time efforts on it. But That's all I've got to say right now. And I will talk to you all next week.